Okay, now we're at the creation of the white light. Obviously, Anu was aware that he will not have interdimensional access in this planet on Earth with his slaves, his creation, and he required a system that runs as him as a manifested God principle. So he needed to automate everything basically in this world, on this planet Earth in existence. So what was already automated was all human beings' pre-programmed life experiences on Earth through the connection of the stars that was made when they were born. They're imprinted into the grid line structure that was placed here on Earth in existence in its entirety, and they just go on and they walk into that which has been already placed as the experience of themselves in this world. Okay, so the white light was then the manifestation of that which connected the dimensions with Earth, the white light. So the white light was connected through the consciousness systems inside human beings, connected to the dimensions. In other words, all human beings were connected to the dimensions. In other words, that's where the Earth and dimensions were separate, but one with the connection of the white light. And Anu realized that he couldn't be everywhere all the time. He required a system, placement as himself. So that's what the white light was. The white light was a system placement of Anu. And then of course he had his gods and his appointed ones, which was usually called masters. Yes, this is the same masters that channels use to channel. So the masters were the ones in charge of the white light. And also, for instance, when a human being dies, then they cross over to the dimensions, Anu's gods, which was the masters or the guides, were basically were also guard manifestations. They basically, the guides basically guarded human beings to make sure that they don't deviate off the placement of their consciousness systems within them, to make sure that they remain a consciousness system and not discover any truth of their existence. So imagine if systems found out their systems and not actually life. It's not actually who they are. Yeah, it's strange. Anyway, so that's what the guides were actually, that was their placement. Then the masters were those that made sure that when the beings cross over with the guides, that they are directed effectively, either for reincarnation, or they're placed also in dimensional planes, which is called the ascension process, or enlightenment process, which is also a form of attainment or progression of some sort. Also to keep dimensional beings busy, because there were more dimensional beings than human beings on Earth, so Anu had to find a way to keep the dimensional beings busy, which was through the idea and perception of ascension to experience heaven. So he made everyone's life shit. Earth, human beings, dimensional beings, so bloody low and worthless and hopeless that they'd want to attain to an experience of a heaven, or to be with a God. Because I'm sure that that's the main reason why everyone wants to go to heaven, because this world is hell. And that's how human beings were designed. And it's not only human beings, dimensional beings as well. Hopeless, worthless, inferior, so that you're able to take the bait of wanting to go to some heaven or etc. So the white light incorporated all this. The entire dimensions was of the white light. In other words, it was placed as Anu, and Anu had like his chamber in the dimensions, where his white light was like his antenna frequency network. It was in everything, all over, human beings, dimensional beings. It was the oneness connector of all that exists. And from there he had his chamber in the dimensions, which was his heaven, his personal placement of existence, which was not on his planet though, it was his own design, within which he had many women, well, from his race, but they projected themselves as women. You know, I told you they were shapeshifters. And he had the basic earth, all human beings and the dimensions here in front of him. So he didn't need to manifest on earth or do anything, because him as his white light placement did everything. If there was a problem, if there was a situation with any being in existence, that placement of him as him, that small placement of the entire placement of himself as the white light, would tell him what was necessary to be done. So that's why I'm saying, Anu didn't have interdimensional access here to earth. He had become the slave to his own creation to a certain extent. So human beings, in truth, human beings and the dimensional beings were placed in this dimensional layer, separate from earth, were all that ever existed here. And all were Anu's slaves, all were lost, trapped consciousness systems. And that's why the white light was designed. So Anu never really actually participated in anything. Now, everyone was doing what they were programmed to do. The human beings carried on with their lives. Dimensional beings fucked around here a bit, through channelings, through mind projection manifestations of themselves. And of course, when you die, then the dimensional beings fucked around in there, because some had the ability to design their own little heavenly experience. Others were lost in those ascension processes of enlightenment, or some form of attainment to a god, or to a God knows what. Okay, this is Jack. This is all I have to say for the moment. I'll continue with the next interview next. Thanks.